Pascal Belin, all at Glasgow University.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we switch off the light? I don't want to be in full view. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I have to say this is the third time I've been to Russia by now, and there's a certain pattern emerging, a regular pattern emerging. Namely, every time I have to give a talk in Russia, I'm totally hungover. And today it's no exception, and please excuse me if I'm not terribly consistent. So obviously one shouldn't send a German who lives in Scotland to Russia. Anyway, so the title of my talk is Mental Simulations of Voice and Speech, or I should better say manner of speaking, during reading of quotations. And this is done in collaboration with Bo Yao, whose name is highlighted in boldface here, because he did actually most of the work. So part of the work that I'm presenting here is from his PhD thesis, right? And Bo just recently passed his viva with flying colors, but that's the reason why he couldn't make it here as well, because it was uncertain at the time when the viva will actually take place. Okay, Pascal Belin is another collaborator, and he's the expert of the fMRI research that I'm going to present. Okay, so good. Okay. Okay. So this research is about the distinction between direct versus indirect speech in making quotations. So these two quotation styles exist in many languages, right? So something like Mary said, "I am hungry," versus Mary said, "that she was hungry." So the first is direct speech, the second is indirect speech. And they often imply differences in perspective. For example, the direct speech quotation is from the perspective of Mary, right? So it's first person and singular, because it's in a moment of time of making that utterance. Versus indirect speech often, but not necessarily, implies a change in morphological features such as person and tense and so on. So Mary said that she was hungry. However, I'm not concentrating on these kinds of syntactic differences or morphosyntactic differences today. What I will be focusing on is important differences in how the two quotation styles are typically used. So there are important differences in usage. Namely, while the main function of indirect speech appears to be to provide a description of what was said by another person, so the person that you quote, the use of direct speech typically also involves a demonstration or depiction or reenactment of how it was said. Right? So in English we have the was-like construction. So people often mimic voice, facial expressions and so on when they quote other people using direct speech. So, and she was like, "Oh God, I'm so hungry," and so on, right? So you cannot do that, or it would be odd to do that in combination with indirect speech. Okay, so that leads to the hypothesis of direct speech as vivid demonstration. So that is an important pragmatic function of direct speech is actually to provide a vivid demonstration, reenactment of the actual speaking situation or the speech act. So that has been observed by linguists like Cannon, and there has also been some psychological work on this, most notably by Clark and Garrick, and by Wade and Clark. So in this experiment, so the latter one, participants had to report previously overheard dialogues to other people, and they were either instructed, so one group of participants was instructed to be very entertaining in reporting, and the other group to just be informative, and that had a very strong effect on the use of direct versus indirect speech. So when you were instructed to be entertaining as a producer, so as a reporter of that previously overheard dialogue, you're more likely to use direct speech rather than indirect speech. So that supports the direct speech as vivid demonstration hypothesis. Okay, but what are the implications for reading of quotations? So that's what we are interested in here, right? Now, we all probably have the intuition of an inner voice, especially during silent reading of direct speech quotations. And even authors of novels and so on, they use that as a stylistic feature. They use a lot of direct speech quotations, of course. However, up to now, there's no real direct objective confirmation of this inner voice experience or intuition that we might have so far. And that is surprising because recent theories in embodied cognition propose that language processing is grounded in mental reenactments, they call it perceptual simulation, of perceptual states and actions. Right? And given that the use of direct speech is grounded in vivid demonstrations, direct speech should be more likely to trigger enriched perceptual simulations or spontaneous auditory imagery of, for example, voice and manner of speaking than indirect speech. And what I'm trying to convince you now that this is actually taking place whilst we're reading text silently, for example. And I will present two investigations. Study one combines fMRI with eye tracking, and here we show that voice-selective auditory cortex area, which had previously been discovered by one of our collaborators, become more active during silent reading of direct rather than indirect speech quotations. In another study, study 2, which I will be reporting, we will look at behavioral consequences in the reading process, and we show that the context preceding a quotation, which might imply either a fast or slow-speaking quoted speaker, has an influence on how fast one would read a quotation in the text, but not how, especially a direct speech quotation, but not how fast one would read an indirect speech quotation. Okay, so the research question of the first study I'm going to report is whether during silent reading, so that's the only thing that we're concentrating on here, right? Silent reading. Do the two quotation styles recruit brain areas that are known to be sensitive to human voices differently? Right? And we were inspired by the groundbreaking work of Bellin and colleagues, which has been published in Nature in 2000, where they showed that there are voice-selective areas in the human auditory cortex. So areas in the brain, in the auditory cortex, that are particularly interested in human voices as opposed to other kinds of sounds, right? Now, our focus is on the top-down activation of these voice-selective areas. So on the inner voice, if you like, during silent reading of direct versus indirect speech quotations. So this is top-down activation that we're looking at because there's no auditory stimulation. So these voice areas, they are discovered by or indicated by an auditory task, but we are using silent reading and we want to see whether these areas become more active during silent reading, particularly of direct speech quotation. So the hypothesis is that silent reading of direct speech quotation should trigger more top-down activation in those voice-selective areas than silent reading of indirect speech quotation, because simply direct quotations are more likely to be grounded in vivid perceptual reenactments of actual speech. So, and that includes aspects of voice and manner of speaking. Right. So the method for this study, you cannot see the background image, but that is good for you because now you can read the slide better. I wanted to show off, and there's a picture of our MRI scanner in the background, but you can't see, so good. Anyway, so we used event-related fMRI combined with eye tracking, and participants had to silently read text, which I will be explaining in a minute. So we had 16 native English speakers, aged 18 to 44 years, 10 of them female, and they had to read stimuli like this. So there were 90 short stories containing either direct or meaning equivalent indirect speech quotation. And that was counterbalanced by that square across participants and item lists and so on. And these stories were always about fictitious protagonists. So the people didn't, or our participants didn't know those people that were mentioned in the text, because these were all made-up stories. So something like PhD student Ella was summoned to her supervisor Jim's office to give a report on her current progress. Ella asked for an extension, but Jim looked concerned. He said, we really need those data in by next month for that conference. So that would be the direct speech condition. Highlighted in red here, the critical region where we actually take the MRI measurements, or during which we take the critical MRI measurements, and we use eye tracking to make sure that participants are actually reading those passages. Okay, The other condition would be exactly the same, but the direct speech quotation replaced by an indirect speech quotation. So he said that they really needed those data in by next month for that comment. Okay, so these were the stimuli for the main experiment, 90 short stories of that sort. And we also had stimuli for the voice localizer, so we used a functional localizer session to identify the voice-sensitive areas in individuals' brains, right? So for that we used 20 vocal and 20 non-vocal sounds, for example, telephone ringing or something like that, for this functional voice localizer session. And this functional voice localizer session was always after the reading session. Okay. Right, so yeah, and this is a schematic of the experiment. So during the main reading session, text was presented in a segment-by-segment manner. So these segments could contain 1 or 2 sentences, so the stories varied in length and so on. And during that time, participants' eye movements were monitored and the scanner was on. And in the final segment, there was a critical quotation, for example. Okay, so the participant's task was just to read the story silently for comprehension. So we asked simple yes, no comprehension questions afterwards to make sure that they read for comprehension. And once that was done, we did the voice localizer session where participants had to listen to 20 vocal and 20 non-vocal sound clips, each 8 seconds long. They had to close their eyes during that task, so we did just auditory stimulation. And we used exactly the same stimuli for this voice localizer as in Bernard et al. 2000. Okay. Right, and here are the results. So the auditory voice localizer regions of interest are highlighted in green, which you cannot see because the projector displays it as, I don't know what kind of color. Okay, but along the left and right axis, you find green areas which are all areas of interest, right? And within those regions, we find significantly higher activation for direct speech than for indirect speech. So this yellow-orangey blobs indicate the difference between direct and indirect speech, so direct speech minus indirect speech. And so whenever it's yellow or orange, then it indicates that direct speech was more active in that region than indirect speech. And that was measured from the first fixation into the critical quotation passage to the first progressive saccade out of the critical quotation passage, as established by eye training. So we also find that strongly right lateral eye patterns. So there are 2 main clusters of enhanced activity for direct as opposed to indirect speech, located in voice-selective areas along the posterior middle part of the right STS. And it is quite interesting because similar areas have previously been associated with emotional prosody processing and stuff like that, suprasegmental processing. In our eye movement records, we did not find any evidence for differences in reading difficulty or syntactic complexity or something like that. The reading times for direct versus indirect speech quotation was absolutely identical. Right? Okay, so from that we can conclude. There is evidence for enhanced auditory mental simulation or imagery, I don't care how you want to call it, of voice during silent reading of direct speech quotations, which are stronger than during silent reading of meaning equivalent indirect speech quotations. So, as reflected in the fact that auditory cortex regions that are particularly interested in human voices become more active, show more top-down activation during silent reading of direct speech quotations. So this is the first step into revealing the kind of inner voices that we might hear, but we don't know, of course, what qualifies these effects. So whether it's your own inner voice or the quoted speaker's voice that you simulate, we cannot tell at the moment. Now, in the next study I want to present, we want to look at behavioral consequences of these purported voice simulation processes. So can auditory voice simulation effects also be demonstrated behaviorally? And for that we use a design like this. So participants had to just read text passages, right? And there were 24 short stories again containing direct or meaning equivalent indirect speech quotations. And here the critical manipulation was whether the context preceding those quotations implied either a fast or a slow-speaking quoted protagonist. Right? And here are some examples. So, in the first context, which implied a fast-speaking protagonist, there's a teenager who was very nervous before his performance of a local competition or something like that, right? Very nervous, nail-biting and so on. And here's the quotation, no, I can't do it, this is the end of the journey, we won't make it this time, right? And yeah, direct speech versus indirect speech. In a slow context condition, there was an old man dying at the Western Infirmary. We had to sit up, but he wanted to say something. So his daughter placed a cushion under his head and slowly moved around and said, and then he says it partly exactly the same as the nervous boy said before, right? So this implies a fast-speaking protagonist. This implies a slow-speaking protagonist. Okay. Now the method that we used was, the first task we used was oral reading, so participants were just instructed to read the stories aloud, and the stories were presented in random order, and we took digital audio recordings during the session, and the reading rate for the critical quotation passages in numbers of syllables produced, per second produced, was our critical dependent variable. And then we did everything exactly again, but in a silent reading task where we used eye tracking. So here the participant's task was to read the stories and some filler items silently, again presented in a random order, and answer comprehension questions after those stories. So here the emphasis was really on reading for comprehension. And we used eye tracking, so a very accurate eye tracker throughout the session. And the reading rate for the critical quotation passages was analyzed in terms of roughly equivalent to first pass reading time. So time from fixation, fixating the passage for the very first time until another reading is fixated. Okay, so actually this research was partly motivated by prior research showing, so by Alexander and Nygaard in 2008, which have demonstrated that oral and silent reading rates are modulated by some kind of auditory imagery. So they show that people indeed read faster when they are instructed to imagine familiar fast speakers as authors of text for reading, right? And that inspired us, but we don't use these kinds of instructions in our experiments here, but rather look at spontaneous reading rate adjustments as a function of quoting style and context. So whether the context implies a fast or a slow protagonist. So inspired by Alexander and Nygaard, we expect that reading rates should be modulated by context, whether the quoted speaker is fast or slow speaker, as implied by the context. And informed by our first study, we predicted that contextual modulation of reading rate should be stronger for direct rather than for indirect speech quotation, because it's the direct speech quotations that imply these vivid mental reenactments of speech and manner of speaking. And this is exactly what we found. So these are the oral reading rates, right? So for direct speech here on the left and indirect speech on the right, and this is in syllables per second, so high figures mean faster processing, right? And we see a clear effect in direct speech, so a fast context, reading rates go up, and with a slow implied speaker in the context, reading rates go down. And in the indirect speech quotation condition, there is no difference whatsoever between the two. And we find exactly the same in silent reading, believe it or not. So these are the average first pass reading times and the critical quotation passages. Now here these are reading times, so high figures mean slow processing, low figures mean fast processing. But in principle it's exactly the same effect. And even if you correlate the silent reading and the oral reading data, there's a very strong by-item correlation of results. So, with direct speech quotation, participants spontaneously act out the contextually implied speech rate of the quoted speaker in the oral reading task, and in the silent reading task, with direct speech quotation, silent readers adjust their reading rate to the contextually implied speech rate of the quoted speakers, which is very interesting because it indicates some kind of high-level control of basic eye movement patterns. Okay, So, to conclude, we find converging evidence from both fMRI and eye tracking, which suggests that readers are more likely to mentally simulate or spontaneously imagine aspects of the quoted speaker's voice and manner of speaking during silent reading of direct speech quotations. This is all consistent with the direct speech as vivid demonstration hypothesis as proposed by Clark and Garrick in 1990, and it is quite strong evidence for perceptual grounding of language comprehension during reading. So, and of direct speech in particular, since direct speech typically occurs in the context of vivid demonstrations or reenactments of actual speech acts, or speech events, I should say, a direct quotation style is more likely to be taken as a cue to engage in enriched perceptual simulations of voice than an indirect speech quotation style. And maybe not only of voice, so we have other experiments actually that visual imagery is enhanced with direct speech quotations as well, which I don't have the time to present. Thank you for your attention.
And we have the lights back. And you have the lights back. Question, please.
Very nice book. I'm personally surprised to see this mindset with something that's highly abstract. With the voice of somebody else, of a person whom you never met, it's just a text. So it's not really important in the same way as
we don't know how concrete the actual representations are that are activated there. So that's why we always cautiously use the formula as aspects of the quoted speaker's voice, which can be anything.
Would you predict a stronger effect or different effect? People reading stories about somebody they know whose voice is there.
Actually, that's exactly what we want to do in the future, yes. Familiarity is an important issue. We just wanted to, so we thought that the strongest demonstration of anything taking place would be something where the voice speakers are completely unfamiliar to you, right? And it's just in a narrative. And we do find the effects. So now we can look into, so once we've established that, actually I would predict that it would be more enhanced if it's a familiar speaker, because you have more detailed information about familiar speakers and so on. So it's very likely that you find stronger effects then.
And I suppose it would be that the person actually associates themselves with the speaker wherever they are.
Yeah.
So they put themselves in the position of
direct
speech position.
Yeah. Actually, that is an interesting question for the future research as well, because we are not sure whether they are mentally simulation, if we accept that notion, whether it's mentally simulating an actual different speaker or themselves. So is it your own inner voice that you're hearing, right? And you basically just mimic the prosody of how things are said and so on. So we're currently conducting some research in that respect.
More questions? Well, I have one. It's basically, I'm following up on your question. You stole my question. I wanted to ask the same one. But, so yeah, basically you have the three routes for simulation. You can simulate your own experience. You can do a sensory motor simulation of repeating somebody else's speech, or you can imagine. So in this case, it's imagination, which can be probably approximate to a mean of what an old man should speak like and what I heard about it. So I'm wondering what would be your prediction for a situation when you are primed by this old man or teenager contact, but then the voice you simulate, as they're Stephen the voice, it contradicts your prediction. So the old man speaks in teenager's voice, and teenager all of a sudden speaks in the old man's voice.
Actually, our very first experiments into the matter were somewhat along those lines, and that didn't work. So I only report, of course, as everybody does, the successes, not the failures, right? So in fact, our first idea was to, for example, present a text, and the quoted speaker in that text is female or male, and then we have a probe word after the text, which occurred in the text, right, which is spoken either by a male or by a female speaker, and we tried it. Something-ish came out, but no, nothing presentable really. It's really, really tricky to pin that down. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much.